It is early 1944, somewhere above northern France. The sky is pale and cold, the air thin and biting. German pilots of Jagdgeschwader 26 scan the horizon from 20,000 feet, their Messerschmitts cutting through high cirrus clouds. Below them the world is silent, a gray patchwork of frozen fields and rivers. Then out of the blinding sun something moves. Tiny glints, silver flashes. For a moment they look like stars falling toward Earth. But the flashes grow, massive metallic shapes slicing through the atmosphere at impossible speed. No warning, no time to climb. The roar hits like thunder, P-47 Thunderbolts. The jugs, in full dive. Their wings quiver under the strain, but they hold. The air screams around them as they fall past 500 miles per hour. Tracers rip the sky. Shells explode against German formations. Engines howl and the horizon tilts in chaos. A German pilot shouts through the static, "Sie fallen wie Meteoriten." They dive like meteors. Moments later, the sky is littered with smoke and flame. The Thunderbolts pull up, engines booming, climbing back toward the sun. For the Luftwaffe below, it feels as if the heavens themselves have opened. By 1944, the air war over Europe had changed beyond recognition. In the early years of the conflict, the German Luftwaffe had reigned supreme, its squadrons sweeping across Europe with unmatched precision and speed. From the fall of France in 1940 to the fierce skies over Britain, the Luftwaffe's Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s had represented the cutting edge of aerial warfare. But by the time American forces entered the European theater, the balance of power had begun to shift. The Allies were learning, building, and adapting, not just in strategy but in engineering. The machine that would symbolize this transformation was the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. The P-47 was not born from elegance. It was born from necessity and power. In the early 1940s, Republic Aviation's chief engineer, Alexander Kartveli, faced a problem. The U.S. Army Air Forces needed a fighter that could compete with the German interceptors and still carry heavy firepower over long distances. Kartveli's solution was unconventional. Instead of designing a nimble, lightweight plane like the British Spitfire, he created a flying brute. The Thunderbolt was the largest single-seat fighter of the war, weighing nearly 8 tons when fully loaded. Its engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, was a massive 18-cylinder radial unit capable of producing over 2,000 horsepower. Combined with a turbo supercharger system, the aircraft could perform at altitudes that left most German fighters gasping for oxygen. When the P-47 first entered service in 1942, pilots were skeptical. They called it a beast, too big, too heavy, too clumsy. But as they took it into combat, the aircraft's true nature revealed itself. The Thunderbolt could dive faster than any aircraft of the time, reaching speeds above 500 miles per hour in a near-vertical descent without structural failure. It could absorb an astonishing amount of damage. Bullets that shredded other fighters barely dented its thick armor and radial engine. In test after test and later in battle after battle, the P-47 proved it was nearly impossible to bring down. The timing of its arrival was crucial. By late 1943, the Allies were deep into their strategic bombing campaign over Europe. Hundreds of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators filled the skies daily, targeting German industrial centers, railways, and oil refineries. But these bombers faced a deadly obstacle: the Luftwaffe's interception wings. German fighters, operating from bases across France, Belgium, and Germany, tore into unescorted bomber formations. Losses mounted. Entire bomber groups disappeared in flames before reaching their targets. The U.S. Army Air Forces needed a fighter that could accompany bombers deep into enemy territory, protect them, and still take the fight to the enemy. The P-47 would become that guardian. Its first missions began in earnest in early 1943, with the 4th and 56th Fighter Groups operating from bases in England. Pilots quickly learned how to exploit the aircraft's strengths. The P-47's incredible dive speed gave rise to a deadly tactic known as boom and zoom. Instead of dogfighting, American pilots attacked from above, diving onto German formations at breakneck speed, firing their 850 caliber machine guns, and then using their momentum to climb back to safety. This made it nearly impossible for the lighter Bf-109s and Fw-190s to follow. German pilots who tried often found their aircraft shaking violently or disintegrating under the pressure of high-speed dives. The Thunderbolt was more than just a fast diver. Its heavy firepower and armor turned it into a multi-role fighter, a machine equally capable of air superiority and ground attack. As the Allied forces advanced across Europe, the P-47s were reassigned from bomber escort to tactical support. Flying at low altitudes, they strafed convoys, rail lines, and tanks with devastating effect. Its pilots affectionately called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, a name that suited both its shape and its destructive potential. From the German perspective, the first encounters with the Thunderbolt were bewildering. Luftwaffe pilots were trained to identify Allied aircraft by silhouette: slender Spitfires, long-nosed Mustangs, and twin-engine Lightnings. But the P-47 looked unlike any of them. It was large and rounded, almost ungainly. Yet, when it appeared above the clouds, it moved with astonishing power. Reports from Luftwaffe intelligence officers in late 1943 described German pilots who were shocked by the Thunderbolt's resilience. They fired burst after burst into its fuselage, only to watch it keep flying, its engines still roaring, its guns still blazing. One German ace described it bitterly. The American Thunderbolt seems to carry its own fortress armor. The psychological effect of the P-47 on the Luftwaffe was profound. The Thunderbolt was not just a fighter, it was a statement. It represented the industrial might of the United States. Factories that could produce thousands of engines, endless ammunition, and pilots trained by the hundreds. For every aircraft Germany lost, America built 2 more. The Luftwaffe, once feared as the world's most advanced air force, now found itself overwhelmed. The Thunderbolt was a symbol of that turning tide. Yet the Thunderbolt's greatest strength lay not in its design alone, but in the men who flew it. American pilots quickly adapted to the machine's unique personality. It was heavy, yes, but it could dive like no other plane in history. They learned to use altitude as their ally. German pilots often flew lighter fighters optimized for tight turns and climbs, but the P-47 pilots avoided those traps. Instead, they operated from higher altitudes, striking from above like hawks. A single pass from a diving Thunderbolt could shred an enemy plane or tear apart a column of vehicles below. By 1944, as the Allies prepared for the Normandy landings, the Thunderbolt had become a central figure in the European air war. P-47s were everywhere, patrolling bomber routes, escorting missions into Germany, and strafing targets across occupied Europe. Their deep growl filled the skies from dawn till dusk, and with every sortie they eroded Germany's capacity to fight. Oil refineries were bombed, trains destroyed, armored divisions immobilized. The Luftwaffe, starved of fuel and pilots, began to wither. The P-47 also played a vital role in developing the new tactical doctrine of air-ground cooperation. American ground forces soon relied on their Jugs for close support. When tanks met resistance or infantry stalled under machine gun fire, the Thunderbolts came roaring down from the clouds, unleashing bombs and rockets with pinpoint accuracy. Soldiers would later describe how the sound of the P-47's radial engine brought reassurance, a promise that they were not alone. In the skies, the P-47's dominance was clear. Between 1943 and 1945, Thunderbolt squadrons destroyed over 7,000 enemy aircraft and tens of thousands of ground targets. It became one of the most successful fighters of the war, not just in Europe, but also in the Pacific. But in Europe, its legend was born in those high-altitude duels against the Luftwaffe, where German pilots looked up to see silver meteors diving from the heavens. By mid-1944, the German air defense network was collapsing. Radar stations were destroyed, fuel convoys bombed, and airfields cratered. The Luftwaffe was forced to deploy inexperienced pilots, many with only a handful of flight hours, against seasoned American veterans in Thunderbolts and Mustangs. The results were devastating. Every sortie by the Luftwaffe came with immense risk, and the roar of the Thunderbolt's engine became a sound of dread across occupied Europe. The P-47 had transformed the nature of aerial warfare. It was no longer about elegance or maneuverability. It was about speed, altitude, and overwhelming firepower. German aces who once dictated the tempo of combat found themselves reacting instead of leading. The once feared FW-190s and BF-109s could no longer outclimb, outdive, or outgun their opponents. The hunter had become the hunted, and yet, for all its technical brilliance, the story of the Thunderbolt was also deeply human. It was about the American pilots who flew thousands of miles from home, who endured freezing cockpit temperatures at 30,000 feet, who returned with bullet holes in their wings and oil streaks across their windshields. It was about the German pilots who faced them, men who watched the skies darken with silver wings, realizing that no amount of skill could stop the inevitable. The stage was set for a confrontation that would define the air war in Europe, a clash between the fading pride of the Luftwaffe and the unstoppable momentum of American air power. The Thunderbolt was ready to descend, not just as a machine of war, but as a symbol of the changing world order. The first time American pilots climbed into the cockpit of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, they knew they were sitting in something different. It wasn't sleek like the British Spitfire or nimble like the German Messerschmitt. It felt heavy, solid, like strapping oneself to a steel anvil with wings. The canopy was wide, the nose massive, and the instrument panel seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. But when the pilot pushed the throttle forward, the aircraft came alive with a deep, vibrating roar that shook the bones. The power of the Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine didn't ease the Thunderbolt into the sky. It hurled it upward. It was an aircraft that demanded respect, one that rewarded strength and precision over finesse. At first, the P-47's size confused its pilots. Many who had transitioned from the nimble P-40 Warhawk or the British Spitfire complained that the Thunderbolt was sluggish. "It feels like flying a battleship," one pilot remarked during training in England. And yet that bulk concealed something revolutionary. Its airframe was built for strength. During test dives, engineers discovered that the P-47 could exceed speeds of 500 miles per hour without breaking apart, something unheard of in the early 1940s. The thick wings, which seemed almost overbuilt, could absorb enormous stress. This feature would soon become the Thunderbolt's most terrifying weapon, its ability to dive like a meteor from the stratosphere. The pilots learned fast. Early tactics against the Luftwaffe emphasized turning and dogfighting, the kind of aerial duels that had defined combat since the Great War. But American pilots quickly realized that was a mistake. The German Bf-109 and FW-190, lighter and more agile, could turn circles around a Thunderbolt, so they changed the rules. Instead of dancing in the sky, they struck from above. They learned to climb high, position themselves over German formations, and then drop, almost vertically, at incredible speeds. The Germans would look up, seeing a glint in the sun, and then nothing but thunder and tracers. Boom and zoom, they called it. One quick, devastating strike, then back to altitude before the enemy could react. It was in these moments that German pilots began to feel something unfamiliar: fear. They were used to controlling the air, to dictating when and how to fight. But the Thunderbolts could dive faster than anything they had ever seen. Their own aircraft, if pushed beyond certain limits, would shake apart in midair. Pilots who tried to follow a P-47's dive found their control surfaces locking up, their wings trembling as aerodynamic forces tore at their airframes. Some never pulled out. Reports from Luftwaffe units in France and Germany describe pilots who vanished in vertical pursuits, consumed by the very sky they tried to master. For the Americans, the dives were exhilarating, but deadly if misjudged. The control forces at those speeds were immense. Pilots had to brace their legs and arms, using every muscle to keep the aircraft from compressing into the ground. The airframe creaked, instruments rattled, and the sound became a physical vibration. Yet the Thunderbolt never failed them. Its rugged design and massive engine could absorb punishment that would destroy another fighter. When the wings groaned, the pilots learned to trust that they would hold. By mid-1943, Thunderbolt squadrons had developed their own identity: confident, loud, and utterly fearless. The 56th Fighter Group, known as Zemke's Wolfpack, led by Colonel Hubert Zemke, became the embodiment of this spirit. Zemke and his men refined tactics that turned the Thunderbolt into the most lethal high-altitude interceptor of the war. They flew in disciplined formations, always maintaining the advantage of altitude. When German fighters appeared, they attacked in unison, diving at over 450 miles per hour, unleashing short, controlled bursts from their 850 caliber Browning machine guns, then climbing away. A single Thunderbolt could carry over 3,000 rounds of ammunition, more than enough to shred a bomber or tear through a fighter's fuselage in seconds. The Germans soon gave the Thunderbolt a grudging respect. Reports from Luftwaffe Command began referring to it as the Klopflieger, or hammer flyer, because of the way it struck from above and vanished before they could respond. German aces who once dominated the skies over France and the Channel began to struggle. They could no longer dictate altitude or speed. The American jugs always seemed to appear first, hit hardest, and disappear into the clouds. But the Thunderbolt story extended beyond air-to-air combat. Its power, durability, and heavy armament made it perfect for a new kind of warfare: close air support. As Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Normandy, the P-47 became a vital component of the tactical air forces supporting ground operations. Fitted with bombs and rockets, the same aircraft that had terrified German pilots at 30,000 feet now turned its fury on tanks, trains, and convoys. Its pilots dove low, sometimes less than 1,000 feet off the ground, braving flak and small arms fire to deliver their payloads. In Normandy, after the D-Day landings, P-47 squadrons operated from hastily constructed airfields just miles from the front. Their job was to destroy anything that moved behind German lines. They struck bridges, columns of trucks, even horse-drawn wagons. German soldiers learned to dread the deep growl of the Thunderbolt's engine. It was not the sleek whine of a fighter. It was a growl, a mechanical rumble that seemed to shake the air itself. Soldiers would dive for cover the moment they heard it. There are accounts of German tank crews who, hearing the sound of approaching P-47s, abandoned their vehicles before the first bombs even fell. They had learned that once the Thunderbolts arrived, survival was a matter of luck. The aircraft's precision rockets and high-velocity guns could turn an armored column into twisted wreckage in minutes. The Luftwaffe's ground control stations recorded entire divisions halted by a handful of Thunderbolts. It wasn't just the destruction they caused. It was the psychological weight. The Germans called them the angels of death from above. Yet despite its fearsome reputation, the Thunderbolt was a pilot's protector. Stories circulated of jugs returning home riddled with bullets, oil pouring from ruptured lines, parts of wings missing, yet still flying. One famous incident involved pilot Francis "Gabby" Gabreski, one of America's top aces, who returned to base after a mission over France with more than 200 holes in his aircraft. The engine was barely holding the hydraulics shot, but the jug landed. Gabreski climbed out, touched the scorched metal, and muttered, "That's one tough son of a gun." The aircraft's survivability earned it an almost mythical reputation among pilots. They trusted it completely. They knew it could get them home. In a war where survival often came down to chance, that trust was everything. From the Luftwaffe's perspective, the Thunderbolt was a nightmare in both air and ground battles. Its presence meant that German fighters had to choose between engaging the bombers, their original mission, or defending their own forces from destruction below. It stretched their resources thin. The once mighty Luftwaffe, already suffering from fuel shortages and declining pilot training standards, was now forced to fight on two fronts: against the bombers in the high sky and against the Thunderbolt sweeping the ground beneath them. Tactically, the Thunderbolt also changed how air warfare was understood. It proved that brute force and altitude could overcome maneuverability and grace. The P-47's design philosophy, prioritizing power, protection, and versatility, would shape jet fighter concepts in the years that followed. The Americans had built not a duelist's aircraft but a brawler, a machine that won through overwhelming strength and endurance. Even the way it looked inspired awe. Its enormous propeller, over 12 feet in diameter, seemed almost too large for its fuselage. Its fuselage bulged with machinery. The turbo supercharger system alone took up nearly half the aircraft's internal volume. But when the pilot throttled forward and that propeller spun, the noise was thunder. German civilians and soldiers alike spoke of the unique growl that echoed long after the planes were gone. As 1944 wore on, German pilots found themselves increasingly demoralized. Many had entered the war with the confidence of aces, believing in the superiority of their aircraft and training. But facing the Thunderbolt, that confidence eroded. "We used to be hunters," one Luftwaffe veteran later recalled. "Now we were the hunted." The skies over France, Belgium, and Germany were no longer their domain. The sound of engines they could not outclimb or outdive became the soundtrack of defeat. For the Americans, the P-47 became a symbol of industrial might, the power of factories in New York, Ohio, and California that churned out aircraft faster than the enemy could shoot them down. Over 15,000 Thunderbolts were built during the war, each one a testament to American engineering and production capacity. In comparison, the Luftwaffe's aircraft production was collapsing under constant bombardment. By the time a new German fighter rolled off the assembly line, there was barely enough fuel to fly it. And yet, there was something deeply human in the contrast. On one side, young German pilots, barely trained, climbing into worn aircraft with dwindling fuel and ammunition. On the other, American aviators, well-fed, well-equipped, confident, flying the most powerful piston-engine fighter in the world. The outcome was inevitable. But in the clouds, as the silver shapes dived from the sun, the realization must have been devastating. The winter of 1944 brought the war to a fever pitch. The Allied air campaign had become relentless. Every morning, the skies over occupied Europe filled with the deep drone of engines. From the ground, it looked as if a steel storm was moving across the heavens. Bombers stretched for miles, and with them came the guardians of the air, the P-47 Thunderbolts. Their silver bodies glinted against the weak sunlight as they formed a protective halo around the slow-moving bombers. Below, the German countryside trembled under the rhythm of advancing armies and burning cities. Above, the Luftwaffe prepared for a fight it could no longer win. By now, German intelligence had a clear understanding of the Thunderbolt's capabilities. Reports described it as nearly invulnerable in a dive, heavily armed and capable of devastating low-level attacks. It had earned nicknames across the front: the Jug, the Tank Buster, the Silver Hammer. The Germans feared it not because it was the fastest or most agile aircraft, but because it never stopped coming. Its arrival meant destruction from which there was no escape. The climax came not in a single dogfight, but in a sustained campaign of dominance that broke the back of the Luftwaffe. In early 1944, American bombers targeted Germany's aircraft production centers, synthetic fuel plants, and communication networks. These missions, deep into enemy territory, would have been suicide without fighter escort. But now the Thunderbolts led the way. With drop tanks attached under their wings, they could escort bombers hundreds of miles beyond previous limits. The sky battles that followed were unlike anything the war had seen before. On February 20, 1944, the Allies launched Operation Argument, a massive offensive later known as Big Week. Its goal was to cripple the German aircraft industry once and for all. Over 3,000 bombers and 800 escort fighters filled the air, striking factories at Regensburg, Augsburg, Stuttgart, and Leipzig. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had to stop them: Bf-109s, FW-190s, even the experimental Me-410 heavy fighters. What unfolded was a sky-wide confrontation, an aerial war above the clouds. Thunderbolt squadrons like the 56th, 78th, and 303rd flew at the vanguard. Pilots like Francis Gabby Gabreski, Robert Johnson, and Hubert Zemke led attacks with ruthless precision. When German interceptors climbed toward the bomber streams, the P-47s pounced. They didn't wait to be attacked, and they struck first. Diving from high altitude, they shredded formations with torrents of 50-caliber fire. German pilots tried to break away, but the Thunderbolts followed, diving faster than any enemy could match. Many German fighters never recovered from those dives. Their wings tore off. Their fuselages disintegrated under the pressure. Robert Johnson, flying with the 56th Fighter Group, later described watching a German FW-190 try to outdive him. The German aircraft plunged vertically, pushing past 400 miles per hour, then 450. Johnson followed, throttle full, the wind screaming against the canopy. The Thunderbolt began to shudder, its wings trembling violently, but it held. The German fighter suddenly disintegrated in midair. Its wings ripped from the fuselage. Johnson pulled out at treetop level, his aircraft intact. "That's when I realized," he said, "we owned the sky." During Big Week alone, the Luftwaffe lost over 600 fighters and hundreds of experienced pilots. Losses it could never replace. The P-47 had done more than protect the bombers. It had destroyed the Luftwaffe's capacity to fight. After February 1944, German air superiority was gone for good. But the Thunderbolt's most defining moments were still to come. In June 1944, as Allied forces prepared for the Normandy invasion, P-47s became the spearhead of air supremacy. In the days leading up to D-Day, they flew hundreds of sorties, striking radar installations, supply convoys, and coastal defenses. On June 6th, as thousands of ships crossed the English Channel, The sky above them was filled with Thunderbolts. They patrolled the invasion zone, shooting down enemy aircraft and attacking German artillery positions. Pilots described seeing the beaches of Normandy below, an endless blur of men, smoke, and metal. The P-47s were their shield. When the landing succeeded, the Thunderbolts followed the ground troops inland. The aircraft's ability to operate from rough airfields made it invaluable in the fast-moving campaign across France. Engineers built makeshift runways on captured farmland, and within hours, P-47 squadrons were landing and refueling just behind the front lines. The aircraft's roar became the soundtrack of the Allied advance. Wherever German resistance appeared, the Thunderbolts struck. Bridges, tanks, convoys. Nothing escaped their reach. In July and August 1944, during the breakout from Normandy, the Thunderbolts achieved near-total air dominance. They decimated German armored divisions trapped in the Falaise pocket. Pilots flew so low that their wings cut through treetops as they fired rockets and cannons into dense traffic jams of German vehicles. After the battle, Allied reconnaissance photos showed miles of wreckage, tanks, trucks, and artillery reduced to twisted metal. Survivors spoke of the terror of the Thunderbolts' attack runs. The German 7th Army was shattered not only by artillery and ground assault, but by the relentless strikes from above. The Luftwaffe, desperate and dwindling, tried to mount a defense. But by late 1944, its ranks were filled with inexperienced pilots, boys barely out of flight school, flying obsolete aircraft with almost no fuel. Against them stood American veterans with hundreds of hours in combat and aircraft that could climb higher, dive faster, and shoot longer. The results were predictable. On many missions, the Thunderbolts would fly unopposed. The once feared Luftwaffe, reduced to a shadow of its former self. Even the introduction of Germany's revolutionary jet fighter, the Messerschmitt Me-262, failed to shift the balance. The Me-262 was fast, faster than anything the Allies had, but it was fragile, poorly supported, and vulnerable during takeoff and landing. P-47 pilots began patrolling near airfields, waiting for the jets to appear. When they did, the Thunderbolts swooped down and caught them as they slowed to land. In one such encounter, Captain Ben Mayo of the 56th Fighter Group destroyed an Me-262 while it was on final approach, riddling it with bullets until it exploded in a plume of smoke. Even the jet age could not save the Luftwaffe now. But it wasn't only in the skies of Western Europe that the Thunderbolt proved decisive. In Italy, in the Balkans, and even in the Pacific, it became the embodiment of American air power. In the Pacific, it replaced the P-40s and P-38s in ground attack roles, strafing Japanese positions and shipping with devastating efficiency. Pilots who had flown multiple aircraft types during the war often remarked that nothing else could take damage and keep fighting, like the Thunderbolt. Still, the heart of its legend remained in Europe. By late 1944, Germany was collapsing on all fronts. The Battle of the Bulge, launched in December, was the Luftwaffe's last major gamble. During the Ardennes offensive, German armored divisions pushed deep into Allied lines, catching many by surprise. But within days, the weather cleared and the Thunderbolts returned to the skies. They struck with a vengeance. Allied reports described P-47s flying continuous missions day and night, bombing and strafing convoys trying to escape the forests. The German offensive stalled, its tanks burned out, its infantry scattered. The Luftwaffe, once the spear of Hitler's war machine, had been reduced to defending its own retreat. In one of the most telling moments of the campaign, a group of German soldiers was captured near Bastogne. When interrogated, they were asked what had broken their attack. Their commander answered simply, "The Thunderbolts." By 1945, the P-47 was more than a fighter. It was a symbol of power, endurance, and inevitability. American pilots flew it across bomb-scarred Europe, over rivers and ruins, through clouds of flak, toward the final victory that everyone knew was near. The Luftwaffe was finished. The last of its aces fought bravely, but they could do little against swarms of Thunderbolts and Mustangs that dominated every layer of the sky. In the final months of the war, Thunderbolts strafed German airfields, railways, and columns of refugees. Their presence marked the end of an era, the twilight of the Luftwaffe and the dawn of a new kind of warfare where technology and mass production triumphed over experience and tradition. German pilots who survived spoke later with a kind of disbelief at what they had faced. "We couldn't believe how fast they dived," one recalled. "It was like being attacked by falling stars." That image, of falling stars, became the defining metaphor for the P-47's war. From the first terrified cries of German pilots who saw them streaking out of the sun, to the final days when their roar echoed over a dying Reich, the Thunderbolt's legend was etched into the memories of all who witnessed it. It had taken the skies by force, reshaped the balance of power, and revealed the industrial heart of the Allied war machine. And as the last flames of war burned out over Europe, one truth became clear. The Luftwaffe had never been defeated by numbers alone, but by a machine that combined power, resilience, and purpose in the P-47 Thunderbolt. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Europe lay in ruins, and above those shattered cities, one machine had come to symbolize the overwhelming force that ended the Luftwaffe's reign, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. Across the continent, wreckage told the story of its campaign. Twisted rail cars lay abandoned on scorched tracks. Convoys of trucks and tanks lay gutted on roads once lined with trees now splintered by gunfire. The Thunderbolt's 850 caliber guns had carved their mark into the landscape of a continent at war. Its bomb loads had crippled the arteries of Nazi Germany's war machine, the fuel depots, the bridges, the trains. And though the war had been decided by many hands, few weapons had embodied the transition from defense to dominance like the P-47. The Luftwaffe's decline had been slow but inevitable. By late 1944, its aircraft production remained impressive on paper, but its heart had been destroyed. The factories at Regensburg and Kassel lay in ruins. The once mighty Junkers and Messerschmitt assembly lines were crippled by bombing and resource shortages. Skilled pilots had been replaced by barely trained recruits. Fuel, the lifeblood of air power, and had become a memory. Allied bombing campaigns, escorted and protected by Thunderbolts, had cut Germany's synthetic fuel output by nearly 90%. Without fuel, aircraft could not train, could not fight, could not flee. The Luftwaffe that had once terrorized Europe during the Blitz had become a defensive shell. Its last operations were desperate gestures, last stands made by men who knew the end was near. In the final months, even Hitler's own headquarters received reports of squadrons grounded not by combat, but by lack of gasoline. The Thunderbolt, along with the Mustang and the Spitfire, had done what no ground invasion could. It had starved the Luftwaffe to death. For the Americans, the P-47's legacy was measured not only in kills but in survival. It recorded more than 7,000 aerial victories, but perhaps its most remarkable statistic was how many pilots it brought home alive. In combat reports, dozens of Thunderbolts returned with engines crippled, oil streaming, and wings riddled with cannon fire, yet somehow still flying. The aircraft's radial engine, protected by armor and redundancy, often kept running even when one cylinder bank was destroyed. Pilots trusted it as they trusted little else in war. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, one of the top aces of the European theater, famously survived an encounter that became the very definition of the Thunderbolt's resilience. In June 1943, his aircraft was hit over France by cannon shells from an FW-190. The canopy shattered, oil flooded the cockpit, and his controls jammed. He was trapped inside as the German pilot circled and poured fire into him, over 200 rounds. But the jug would not fall. Somehow the engine kept roaring. Johnson managed to limp back across the channel, landing safely in England. When mechanics inspected his plane, they counted 21 hits from 20mm cannon shells, hundreds of bullet holes, and one undetonated explosive lodged in the fuselage. Johnson's words echoed through every Thunderbolt squadron afterward. If I ever had to choose a plane to get shot at in, I'd choose the P-47 every time. That kind of endurance changed more than tactics. It changed psychology. In the air, survival meant confidence, and confidence meant victory. American pilots began flying with a sense of invulnerability that unnerved their German counterparts. They attacked more boldly, strafed lower, and fought longer. The P-47's design, derided by some engineers as overbuilt, had become a source of moral strength. The numbers told a larger truth. By the end of the war, Republic Aviation had produced more than 15,600 Thunderbolts, making it the most manufactured American fighter of World War II. In contrast, Germany's fighter output was collapsing under Allied bombardment. The United States had mastered something the Reich could not: the marriage of technology and industry. American factories operated day and night, filling the skies with new aircraft faster than they could be destroyed. A single American assembly line could produce more Thunderbolts in a month than Germany could replace in an entire quarter. To the men on the ground, the Thunderbolt had become a weapon of liberation. French villagers remembered the sound of its engines as the prelude to freedom, the deep rumble of American power sweeping away occupation. To Allied soldiers, that same sound was reassurance. During the Battle of the Bulge, when German tanks threatened to encircle American forces, the weather cleared for just a day, and hundreds of Thunderbolts took to the air. They tore through enemy lines, halting the offensive in its tracks. Ground troops later said they could feel the concussive blasts from their rockets as if the sky itself were fighting beside them. To the Germans, that same sound carried another meaning: inevitability. The Thunderbolt symbolized the industrial giant that the Third Reich could never match. It represented the factories of Detroit, the forges of Pittsburgh, the assembly lines of Farmingdale and Evansville. It was America's strength condensed into aluminum and steel, a flying declaration that total war would be won not by the swiftest or most elegant machine, but by the one that could endure. In post-war interrogations, captured Luftwaffe officers admitted their disbelief at the scale of Allied production. Many had assumed that American resources were exaggerated, propaganda. One pilot recalled his shock upon seeing endless rows of Thunderbolts lined up at a captured airfield in France. "We thought they were decoys," he said. "There were so many of them, it looked impossible." Yet behind those numbers were the men who flew them, ordinary Americans, many scarcely in their 20s, who had crossed an ocean to fight in a sky filled with smoke and steel. The Thunderbolt became their companion, their armor, and sometimes their coffin. More than 3,500 P-47s were lost in combat. Some vanished over France and Germany. Others went down in the icy waters of the Channel. For every pilot who survived a mission, there was another who didn't come back. The Thunderbolt may have been nearly indestructible, but war always found its cost. After the war, the aircraft itself endured one last transformation. With peace came demobilization, and the Jug, once the titan of the skies, began to fade from frontline service. The U.S. Air Force, newly independent in 1947, turned its attention to jet fighters like the F-80 Shooting Star and F-86 Sabre. Yet the Thunderbolt's legend continued overseas. It served in the air forces of France, Italy, Brazil, and even post-war Germany, flying for years after the conflict ended. In each it carried the same reputation: unstoppable, unbreakable. For engineers, the Thunderbolt left an even greater legacy. Its turbo-supercharger system, a masterpiece of mid-war engineering, paved the way for the pressurization and performance standards of post-war aircraft. Its philosophy, power and survivability over elegance, influenced designs well into the jet age. The Republic Aviation Company would later adapt that same design DNA into the F-84 Thunderjet and, decades later, the A-10 Thunderbolt II, a ground attack aircraft whose very name paid tribute to its ancestor and whose mission echoed the same principle: protect the men on the ground and always come home. For historians, the P-47 became a symbol of industrial war's brutal logic, that sheer production, engineering resilience, and strategic adaptation could overcome experience and artistry. The Luftwaffe had entered the war as a precision instrument. The Allies ended it as a machine of mass efficiency. The Thunderbolt was the physical manifestation of that shift, and for the German pilots who faced it, the memory never faded. Many later described their first encounters not with bitterness but with awe. One veteran told an interviewer decades later, "We saw them diving, silver flashes falling from the sun. We thought they were mad. No plane could survive such a dive. Then we saw them pull out, climb again, and we realized this was something new." In every theater of the war, the Thunderbolt earned respect, not only from those it protected, but from those it destroyed. It had entered the conflict as an ungainly brute, doubted by its own pilots and mocked by its enemies. It ended it as a legend. By the time the last P-47s flew home, the world they had fought for had changed. Cities lay in ashes, empires had fallen, and the jet age was dawning. Yet the sound of that great radial engine, deep, confident, indomitable, lingered in memory. It was the sound of a new kind of power, a new kind of world. And as Europe rebuilt from the wreckage, The image of the Thunderbolt diving through clouds remained burned into history, not just as a weapon of war, but as a symbol of endurance, innovation, and the will to prevail. In the calm that followed the chaos as Europe rebuilt and the guns were silenced, the story of the P-47 Thunderbolt became something greater than the sum of its victories. It was not merely an aircraft, it was a statement about what modern warfare had become. The Thunderbolt was proof that wars were no longer won by a single ace in the sky, but by the union of industry, intellect, and endurance. Its presence marked a turning point in the evolution of air combat. Before it, wars had been fought by light, agile machines in swirling duels of reflex and skill. After it, the future belonged to machines of power and technology, aircraft that could climb higher, dive faster, and endure more punishment than any human could imagine. The Thunderbolt bridged that gap between eras. It was both the last of the great piston-powered titans and the first glimpse of what industrial air power could achieve. For the men who flew it, the bond was personal. They spoke of the Jug with affection, not as a tool but as a companion that had carried them through hell and brought them home again. To a pilot, it was more than metal and rivets. It was trust made tangible. And to those on the ground, to soldiers who saw its shadow overhead or civilians who heard its thunderous approach, it was both protector and portent, the sound of deliverance wrapped in the fury of war. To the Germans who once ruled the air, the P-47 was a harbinger of the New World. Its dives were not just attacks. They were the sound of inevitability, of a war machine that could not be matched or stopped. When they saw it streaking down like a falling meteor, they saw the future, and their own defeat within it. In the decades that followed, historians would call the P-47 many things: the workhorse, the anvil of the skies, the hammer of victory. But those who truly understood it knew it stood for something deeper. That in the darkest years of the 20th century, human ingenuity and determination had built a machine that turned thunder into freedom.